Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Educator Wellness Revolution. We are super excited to continue our series today on mentorship. When we talk to educators in schools that we are partnered with and educators throughout the district, we know how important it is, especially in those early years of teaching, to have someone you can rely on and go to with questions to support your pedagogy, but also to support you in so many other ways to get accustomed to a school environment, to navigate difficult things, whether that's your relationships, your leadership and supervision, or so many things that can be challenging for a new teacher in a new environment. And how mentorship also helps folks who have been in the classroom for a while. So we're excited to have this conversation today with Jen Briones of the DC State Board of Education. So Jen, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Scott, for that introduction. And thank you to Empower Ed for having me today. I'm deeply passionate about this issue, especially. My name is Jen Briones. As he said, I'm the Deputy Director of Policy and Research at the DC State Board of Education. So for those who are unfamiliar with us, we are a government agency in DC that's focused on education. There are 9 elected state board members, one that has been elected to represent each ward in Washington, D.C., and then one representative who represents the district at large, which is Jacques Patterson, who is now our new president, and also 4 student representatives that are appointed each school year. And so altogether, our agency brand really is the voice of the public because these members are the only elected body that have been elected to focus solely on public education.
Jen, say
And
that again.
so
Say that again. What is the DC State Board of Education? The only elected officials.
who have been elected to focus solely on public education. So if you think of your ANC or council member, they focus on a lot of different issues that their constituents and communities are dealing with on a day-to-day basis. But these state board of education members are here to hear the the concerns, the questions of teachers, parents, students, community members specifically about public education in DC.
We love that. And
And
how did you get here? How did you end up at the state board?
yeah, that's a great question. I actually, our executive director, Bernice Butler, she and I used to work together at Data Quality Campaign, or DQC, which I know is a nonprofit that many people in DC are familiar with. They come and participate on our public meeting panels occasionally as well. We worked there together as essentially policy analysts earlier in our career. And when this job of Deputy Director of Policy and Research was becoming available, that's when we had always stayed connected, as former colleagues and friends. And so it just kind of aligned with where I was in my career as well. So I ended up back here, but also my first job, one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about educator voice and educator wellness, especially, is because my first job in DC was at an organization that was similar to Empower Ed, provided teachers with fellowships. So in a few different states, but also nationally, and really showing them what it means to advocate, showing them the policy process and how you can have a voice and you can be involved. And on the flip side, introducing them to their legislators and showing these policymakers, if you're going to be making policy that directly affects teachers, you need to bring them to the table. And so while I've never been in a classroom as an educator myself, I'm so passionate about making sure that educators and your voices are always included.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing, your journey to this role and to the state board. And again, for highlighting like the importance of teacher voice, which of course, we are all about. And we're here today to talk about mentorship. And we are so excited that the state board of education is focusing on mentorship now. So why has the state board chosen to make mentorship a priority this year? And how do you see the connection to teacher wellness and teacher retention?
Absolutely. That's such a great question. First of all, I'm going to say that, of course, my role as Deputy Director of Policy and Research is to oversee any work related to policy and research that the agency does, which is guided by the priorities and the goals of our elected members. So everything I say will be from my perspective in this staff role, but also I'm going to share about the work that the state board has already done and passed as well. Um, Regarding teacher mentorship, what we obviously have Ben Williams, who is a current DCPS teacher and has been teaching for several years in the District of Columbia, serving on the state board as the Ward 1 representative. We have several former educators on the state board as well. And so I think that's one of the core reasons why our members always want to hear the voices of educators. And for mentorship specifically, they passed a resolution in December of 2024, SR 24-27, calling for a comprehensive induction and mentoring program for new teachers in the District of Columbia. And this came from the Educator Excellence Committee. And the members of that committee really wanted to focus on induction, so professional development for teachers who are new to the profession, especially knowing how, I mean, close to half of the DC teacher workforce consists of educators who are between the first and the fifth year of their career. And that just, to me, shows how critical it is to make sure that these new educators are taken care of. And I think the members wanted to focus on mentorship for that reason. We also heard and constantly hear public witness testimony from Empower Ed Fellows and other teachers in the DC area talking about what they experience, the stress, the fact that they don't feel like they've had sufficient mentorship. They don't have enough leadership opportunities or ways to, they want to help their new colleagues, but they don't
Yeah.
know how.
Yeah.
So I obviously want to hear your perspective on that too, but I think that's really the impetus for why the committee wanted to work on this resolution and how it ultimately came to be passed.
Yeah, and before we dive deeper into mentorship and all that it means, how we do it well, step back for the policy notes that you noted, which is first that the State Board of Education are the only elected representatives in the city that are exclusively focused on education, but also just that there are active teachers on the State Board of Education, because it has only been, I think, something like 4 years where that has been true in the district. And then immediately we had an active teacher run at Ben, who filled that Ward 1 seat. We've had a lot of former teachers who have been on the board previously, but now there are several people who have been on the board who are former teachers and an active teacher, more than one active DCPS employee actually that's on the board now. And so that is really important in informing why something like mentorship gets to be a priority. And I think an important lesson for folks listening who may be in other places in the country where that's not possible. And the board is set up in a way to allow someone to be an active educator, a practitioner, and still be able to lend that voice. And I think that has a big influence over what kind of policy priorities there will be, is having those voices of the people who by day are experiencing the challenges of being an educator, right? And then going and stepping into that leadership role and setting priorities in that way. So as we talk about mentorship, why do you think it's important that this is something that happens system-wide in a district, rather than just school by school? Then let's see if it's a priority for that principal. Let's see if educators bring it up and maybe it pops up here or there, but why should it be a system-wide priority?
Yeah, I think, well, from my perspective personally, I think that all teachers deserve equal and equitable access to mentorship. The resolution, I think, gets into that. I'll mention it a lot just because it's so recent and has so much of the content that explains why this is important. The Learning Policy Institute, which we leaned on a lot and presented at the Educator Excellence Committee, because they've done amazing research on this topic, they had a survey at UDC of teachers or students who were studying to be teachers and asked them specifically about, what induction or mentoring, if any, have you experienced? And the results were kind of inconsistent, right? Like kind of showed a lack of awareness or clarity. Some teachers were really emphasizing that they didn't have, like they noticed that there was a lack of a system-wide induction program. Others were saying, well, I think it's important based on where teachers are placed, whether induction and mentoring occurs. So the responses were kind of all over the place. And another thing that's mentioned in the resolution is pointing to the research that schools that serve higher percentages of students from low-income families are disproportionately affected by teacher turnover, and thus would benefit the most from strong induction programs, again, because the effects of those programs are improving retention and
Yeah.
ultimately student outcomes. And then finally, um, especially beneficial for schools serving students of color and students from low-income families, which applies across the District of Columbia as well. And I want to hear, your reactions and thoughts on that, obviously based on your own experience and what you hear from your fellows as well.
Yeah, setting up these mentorship programs is always a challenge because obviously we hear from educators every day how important mentorship is. It was important to me as an educator, and I think for me the best mentors that I had were the people who naturally I formed relationships with because we shared a classroom or because they taught the classroom across the hall. And I remember probably one of the best mentors that I had in teaching was literally the person who was directly across the hall from me, and she was an experienced social studies teacher. She was an amazing educator and put so much work and thought to all of her planning. But really, it was also just these like 5 minutes between classes that I was learning from because like we would step out into the hallway at the same time when classes were changing and we'd both be at our door across from each other and we'd have these tiny little debriefs, right? About how that just went and what's going on. And it was also just getting the pulse of what's happening in the school at that moment because every day is very different for an educator and there's a lot of navigating every interruption that happens. Is this student actually here today? Is there coverage for this class? And all the stressors that can come up during a day. But I also think just like those organic relationships are so important to be part of mentorship, and that presents a challenge to us in designing them because we're trying to now design them for a lot of schools. And what we see is that we want everybody to have it, and we want to make sure it exists everywhere, just like this resolution is calling for. And we know if we overly structure it, it can seem like a mandate and then something that people say, oh, I have to do this thing. I have to go into do my hour with my mentor, and then I have to report back to someone. And that's not what we want it to be, right? And so, yeah, it's really, it's a fine line and how we walk it. How do we make sure everybody feels the support of a quality mentorship without it being something that feels like a mandate to them? And it is just the way that like we make sure there's not someone who doesn't have that teacher in their classroom or across the hall from them who they can lean on, and that no one falls through the cracks in that way, and everyone does feel like they have someone to go to. I know, Caroline, what was it like for you as a teacher and what you've heard?
Yeah, that's funny because I was just looking at some research about like best practices in mentoring, and I was looking at a research study that was done, I think, in Missouri, in the school district, where they gave all of the first and second year teachers two mentors, actually. So they had an instructional mentor and then like a like role mentor. And I was thinking, I was like, that's such a great idea. And I actually benefited from that, at least in my first year of teaching, where I did have an instructional mentor who's also on this podcast and is wonderful. And then I had a co-teacher who's sort of like a like role mentor. And it was great because, I mean, it was scaffolded so that we had the same, planning period. And it really helped me grow a lot of confidence as a first year educator, having that experience. But I think it is a lot of times in those sort of organic moments that you are building the skill set and building the relationship. And that is hard to mandate, but we can systematize a structure for it and a floor to make sure that this is something that continues. And so I guess the next question then would be, from your research, what other best practices in mentorship have you identified? Anything you found that should be avoided? What should we really be looking for?
Yeah, and I thank you both for sharing your perspectives there because based on what you said, and how you're working on trying to design these programs, I mean, I feel like there could be some type of happy medium, right? And like in the same way that not every social studies teacher has to teach it in the exact same way or use the exact same lesson plans, like you can have some sort of structure and parameters, but also allow each school and each teacher to personalize it in their own way. Regarding the research, in my almost 2 years here, excuse me, we haven't done unique research on mentorship entirely. A lot of the resolution content, again, came from the great work. We don't want to reinvent the wheel also. So the Learning Policy Institute spent a lot of time researching this, and we read the materials. We had them at the committee meeting and used a lot of the resources that they cited as well. So they provided so much incredible information, including some best practices. high quality mentoring with rigorous mentor selection. So making sure that, for example, as you just said, Caroline, you have somebody that's teaching the same subject or grade as much as possible as a mentor, making sure that it's individualized observation, feedback, and coaching, but without any type of like formal evaluation or anything like that. Protected time, which is something I know we and you all talk about a lot, making sure that there's that planning time and the shared planning time between the mentor and mentee, so that they have those kind of regularly scheduled interactions. Maybe they're not across the hall, but if you have that time together that has been scheduled and will not be interrupted or deprioritized for anything else. Participation in seminars, and they refer to this as intense professional development. So maybe again, just dedicated time for that professional development. And then finally, ongoing communication with and support from school leaders. So I really like those best practices because I think they kind of span different areas and they're very comprehensive, but not almost not too prescriptive, as I just said also.
Yeah, I want to circle back to something you said earlier, but that the dedicated time and like support from school leaders is really important, as is the support from, district or the education cluster as a whole, right? Because earlier on you mentioned that turnover and lack of mentorship is something that especially affects low income schools, schools with majority students of color. And so those are schools that often things like mentorship get deprioritized, right? We have to push other outputs first. And so I think it's really critical that the state board has issued this resolution to say that, no, this is something we really need to invest in heavily at all schools and at all levels. So I appreciate that as well.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, like you said, scheduling is always a piece of the puzzle here, and that can be really complicated. And figuring out how to make sure that people are invested in this. I mean, in the schools where we've been working on this, it really is different based on the kind of foundation that you have. I mean, I think one of the schools where we've gone in, they were really, really primed and ready to do this. And I think what that's turned into is that we can kind of have a light touch and be there. And I think we don't think about the need for kind of a support structure for it sometimes. But I think having a partner like what we do with many of our schools is just to make sure that it's going all right, that the mentors and the mentees have what they need, that we can actually schedule some time to convene them. We can bring a little food in, we can make it, enjoyable for them to debrief with each other. And we can kind of be a bridge between the leadership of the school and the mentors and the mentees to make sure the structures are there from a school perspective such that this is something they want and they feel like their school is actually supporting them to do it. And I think when those things are there, it actually doesn't require that much, right? Because the mentors really want to do it, and they are pushing to have that time, both in formal and informal ways. And so I think the investment from leadership is really important. And what we've seen actually, and as a little bit of a preview to our next podcast episode in this series, is we'll talk to a principal who is doing this right now that not only is implementing mentorship at his school among the educators, but is also doing reverse mentorship where he is being mentored by a teacher, which is a really fascinating thing in terms of how effective it can be and the kind of support it provides. So I won't say too much and we'll let him share more about that. But I think having investment from the school leader is really important. And one of the ways they invest in it is financially, right? Is actually to pay the mentors, teachers for their time. I was surprised to find out when we did research on this, how many states actually mandate that in code, that they have a mentorship program and that people will be compensated for their time and participation. There are some states or districts where they require both a mentor and mentee to receive compensation for it, some where it's just the mentor. So I'm curious your thoughts on that, on pay, and then maybe any other incentives to get this to be sustainable.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Learning Policy Institute also shared with us several examples of states and also large cities that have done this. As you mentioned, Education Commission of the States also has one of their reports. I think it's from 2022, where they go state by state regarding teacher retention. And that one said 14 states have required that an established portion of a teacher's day and work week be designated, not entirely on mentoring, but exclusively for teacher planning. I do think that's a big component of why teachers should be paid for their time. I mean, we even when former Representative O'Leary presented the resolution to the Student Advisory Committee, and there were probably at least 40 students from across DC at this meeting. The biggest question that the students were asking was, well, if this were to be implemented, would those mentor teachers be paid for their time? So I wanted to share that with everyone too, because it was heavy on the students' mind as well. And they're the ones that are being taught by these teachers.
Yeah.
They also, former Representative O'Leary also asked at one point how many of them had a teacher leave at some point during the school year. So not at the end, but during the school year, and everyone raised their hand as well.
Wow. And I want to
Speaking to
say
that,
just
yeah.
like about the student thing real quick, that like I am always so impressed that the student representatives
Hmm.
have so much perspective on the experience of their teachers.
Yeah.
That, I think like when they ask questions at the state board, you get the real sense that they really think about their teachers, not just kind of in the position of power they are in the classroom, but like as people. And that's really
Yeah.
refreshing to see because it's a perspective we need. Yeah, and so helpful. So great that the state board has that perspective.
Yeah, I think that's such a great point too, because I feel like there is a misconception like that students are just, they're there and they think of their teacher just as a teacher and not as like a whole human being, which again going back to the wellness piece. That's a whole part of educator wellness, is just recognizing that all teachers, regardless of whether or not they have a family at home or like out, just like any other professional, just like me in this, standard office 9 to 5, like has a life outside of their profession. And what are you doing to take care of that? And again, pay is part of that. One of I think the benefits is enabling the mentor teacher, of course, to be able to provide that personalized growth opportunity for their mentees, making sure that like their time, it is an investment and that their time that they're being invested in as well. Um, and one of the recommendations that the state board has in the teacher retention crosswalk that was released last year, so that's one of the things that me and my team oversee as well. Any like policy briefs or documents written from the agency is to take measures to reduce that job creep in teachers. And for those who are unfamiliar with the term, that's when any professional is gradually asked to take on additional responsibilities that are outside of their day-to-day or job requirements. And again, I really want you all to chime in here, because especially with those specific examples, because we all know that is something that causes the burden on the teachers. And we don't want this to be adding to that. And so the pay would definitely I think help kind of alleviate some of those concerns as well.
It's like job creep is like that's what teaching is. And
Yeah,
it's we have to find ways to stop it, right? And protect teachers' well-being and allow them to focus on their main job, which is to educate students. But I think it's just I'm sure it happens in all professions, but it's hard to imagine it happening more than it does in education because we're
yeah,
trying to care for the whole student too, right? And so part of that is we keep adding layers of it. And that's good. And there are some who think there's too many adults in our buildings, but the reality is, and that's why we've been big advocates for community schools. Like we need others in the building to be providing those wraparound services that are essential to our students so that educators can focus on educating. And obviously that goes along with providing the feedback to students that they do and having connections to families and all that's critical to the job. But job creep is very real, and protected time is so important.
Yeah. Um, I think that's something that we hear all the time from our educators is that, and this is also going along with like our analogy that we bring up often, which is that teaching is a team sport, education is a team sport. And so in that case, like there is a little bit of job creep because we are all pitching in together, like Scott said, to care for the whole student. But we can also implement like working condition improvements. And then again, yeah, that time compensation is really, really important. Compensating for that time. And there's a lot of states, I think Minnesota, for example, is using that stipend as a way to recruit certain mentors. So they are offering an additional stipend for educators of color to mentor, which I think is really special. And I think in some other states, they're using that stipend to incentivize retired teachers, retired educators to share their knowledge as well. And I think that's really special, making sure that we are using the community as a resource and not shutting them out. Um, just sort of as a closing question, what kind of monitoring, and this is like the government big hat question, but what kind of monitoring is important to make sure mentorship programs are successful for the educators, for the students? And I love as well that you brought up like that the students feel this is really, really vital to the health of our school system, um, to the schools, to the educators. How can we make sure this is successful?
Yeah, and I think you bring up a great point, and that it's kind of encompasses the conversation we've had today. Is just it's all part of this ecosystem, right? Like whether you are a student in the classroom or a teacher or working for in the government or in a position where you are a policymaker creating policies that impact all of these people. It's I think in terms of monitoring, it's also what we've discussed of ensuring that there are just clear, open lines of communication and just regular check-in points, not just between the mentors and the mentees, but also those who are, bringing it up a level, who's designing and implementing the programs and making sure that it's being done in a thoughtful way that makes sense for each person and each school as well. And then I think another critical thing is that consistency system-wide, but also allowing for that personalization, right? So somebody who teaches music is gonna have a different mentorship approach than somebody who's teaching like pre-calculus. Um, and so it simply wouldn't make sense to have something that is too rigid either. And so again, that's why those clear, open lines of communication are so important. And again, why the advocacy that Empower Ed Fellows and other teachers have in realizing that they do have a voice and the ability to, again, so much of this resolution too comes from directly from what we were hearing from the teachers and what they're experiencing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah. Jen, can I surprise you with a little lightning round question here at the end?
I love it.
All
Yes.
right. What is one misconception people have about the State Board of Education?
Ooh, this is a great question. Well, I'll say this. We do as staff go out to many of the community events where our elected members also are. For example, EdFest or some of those, um, big events that are going on across the city. And many times I will ask, have you ever heard of the State Board of Education? And they will say no. So maybe not necessarily a misconception, but just not knowing that our agency exists in the first place. And I know that's something that those of us who are on the staff of the agency, but also of course the elected members want to. That's why we want to keep being out in the community and keep letting people know that the elected members especially are there for you to help you.
Yeah. What's a piece of work that you've done that needs to get more attention
Oh,
outside
that's
of
a
this
good question
mentorship
too.
issue?
Yeah, yeah. I don't know if it's necessarily more attention because I know that it has gotten attention, but aside from mentorship, there was also the crosswalk on chronic absenteeism and truancy. I know that is an issue that, of course, affects so many students and parents, families, teachers, everybody involved in our local communities. So I would encourage folks to check that out. The state board also at the January public meeting last week approved the annual report for 2024. So that is just an overview of the work that the agency did over the year, including a lot of those community events, great photos with many of you Empower Ed folks in these photos as well, because yeah, we
Try to show
love,
up.
yeah, we love working with you all and having that partnership again across the community. So
Yeah.
I think I just want to remind folks that you can contact your state board representative with any questions, comments, concerns. And also you're welcome to testify at any of our public meetings typically held on the third Wednesday of the month. And you can also send in written testimony at any time if you're unable to or not ready to do it in person or on Zoom yet.
Yes, we'll make sure in the show notes we have the link to sign up to testify at the State Board of Education. And Jen, who's your favorite member of, just kidding. I have one final question for you, which is, did you have a mentor yourself? And what was that like?
Yeah, I think that's an amazing question. I've had several. I would say Bernice is one of them, absolutely. I think that the person that was my direct manager in that first job, working alongside those teacher fellows and just literally seeing the light bulbs go off on when they got the title of fellow, or when we would call them teacher leaders, or when we would help them create a LinkedIn page and say like, hey, now you are this professional, you have this power and this ability and this voice, and make sure you can say like, hey, I'm nationally board certified, like show off those credentials, right? And so her name is Wendy Uptain, and she really mentored me and helped me understand again why this is important. She was a former educator herself and just connected me to all of these amazing educators, many of which I'm still connected with and have really changed my perspective on education in general and on policy. So I also pride myself on being a mentor for folks that are in the same graduate program that I did, or yeah, sometimes I'll get random outreach like that. Or there was an American University student who wanted to talk to me because she wasn't used to seeing people like that who looked like her
Hmm.
in these positions
Yeah.
in government. And so yeah, I think in general, mentorship is incredibly important, regardless of what profession you're in.
Jen Briones of the DC State Board of Education, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Caroline.